The stranger in the cold. The wind howled across the frozen wasteland, carrying sharp ice that bit into Ethan's skin like tiny knives. His gloved hands trembled as he fed the last piece of wood into the small fire. The flames flickered weakly, struggling against the icy wind. If the fire died, he wouldn't last long. Ethan had landed on this planet 3 days ago after his ship crashed. His emergency shelter had been destroyed, and his only chance of survival was this fire. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to hold on to whatever warmth was left. Then he saw it, a shadow moving in the storm. Ethan's heart pounded. His hand went to his plasma knife, gripping it tightly. The shadow was huge, towering over him. As it came closer, the swirling snow revealed its shape. It was an alien. She was at least 12 feet tall, her body covered in shimmering blue skin that looked almost like glass. Her long arms shivered, and her bright silver eyes locked onto the fire. She took a slow, unsteady step forward, then another. Ethan stood up, knife in hand. "Stay back," he warned. The alien didn't stop. Her voice was weak, shaking as she spoke. "Human, may I share your fire?" Her voice was deep but trembling. "I won't survive without you." Ethan didn't move. He had never seen her kind before. Was she dangerous? Was she lying? The alien swayed on her feet, her body shivering so violently that she almost collapsed. Snow clung to her skin, turning to ice. Her breathing was slow and uneven. She was freezing to death. Ethan hesitated. He didn't trust her, but he couldn't watch her die either. Survival came first, and maybe she wasn't a threat. "Stay there," he said, stepping back. He gestured toward the fire. But no sudden moves. The alien didn't answer. She took a few weak steps and sank to the ground near the fire. She held out her trembling hands, soaking in the heat. The ice on her skin started to melt. Ethan watched closely. She was massive, but right now she looked small, vulnerable. "What's your name?" he asked. The alien closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Relka." Ethan didn't give his name. He just kept watching her, waiting for her to show any sign of hostility. But Relka only sat there, shivering, staring at the fire like it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Silence stretched between them. Only the crackling of the fire and the howling wind filled the air. After a while, Relka spoke again. "Your kind survives like this." She gestured toward the fire. Ethan frowned. "Yeah, fire keeps us warm. Don't you have something like this?" Relka shook her head. "Not fire. My kind, we survive through heat, but not like this." She rubbed her arms. "I am not supposed to be in this cold. I should not be here." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Then why are you here?" Relka hesitated. She lowered her gaze. "It is complicated." That was not a good answer. Ethan's grip on his knife tightened. If she wasn't supposed to be here, then what was she doing on this frozen planet? Before he could ask more, a deep guttural growl echoed through the storm. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. That was not the wind. Relka's eyes snapped open. She turned her head sharply toward the darkness beyond the fire. "We are not alone," she whispered. Ethan grabbed his plasma knife and stood up, scanning the darkness. Shapes moved in the snow, low, fast, and hungry. Predators. The fire was small. Too small. It wouldn't keep them safe. Relka tried to stand, but she stumbled, still weak from the cold. Ethan cursed under his breath. He had a choice to make: run and leave her behind, or fight and hope they both survived. The growls grew louder. The creatures were getting closer. Ethan gritted his teeth. He couldn't leave her behind. He tightened his grip on the knife and stepped in front of the fire. "If you want to live, Relka, you better be ready to fight." Night hunters. The fire crackled weakly as the wind howled through the frozen wasteland. Ethan gritted his teeth, holding his plasma knife tighter. The growls in the darkness grew louder, more insistent. Relka, still shivering from the cold, struggled to rise. The towering alien was weak, her blue skin still covered in frost, her breath slow and labored. Whatever strength she once had was buried beneath the freezing grip of this planet. Ethan didn't know how much fight she had left in her, but he did know one thing. They weren't alone anymore. The shadows moved. Low, sleek forms circled just beyond the fire's light. Predators. Ethan had seen creatures like these before. Pack hunters, patient and calculating. They waited until their prey was exhausted before striking. Ethan had no intention of being their next meal. A pair of glowing yellow eyes locked onto him from the darkness. A second later, a massive creature lunged from the storm. Ethan reacted on instinct. He dove to the side, rolling as the beast slammed into the spot where he had been standing. The thing was huge, at least 7 feet long, covered in thick, ice-coated fur. Its jaws snapped shut inches from his face, revealing razor-sharp teeth. He slashed with his plasma knife, the blade cutting a deep gash into the creature's side. It let out an ear-splitting shriek and staggered back into the snow. Before Ethan could react, 2 more emerged from the shadows. One lunged at Relka. She tried to move, but her limbs were still sluggish from the cold. The creature tackled her, knocking her onto her back. Its claws raked against her armor, struggling to find a weak point. For the first time, Ethan saw fear in her silver eyes. She was too weak to fight back. Ethan cursed and sprang forward. He threw his entire weight against the creature, knocking it off her. The beast tumbled into the snow, snarling. He turned to Relka. "Can you fight?" She gritted her teeth, frustration clear on her face. "Not like this." Another growl. Ethan barely had time to react before one of the creatures slammed into him from behind. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his ribs. The predator's teeth sank into his shoulder, tearing through his jacket. He yelled in pain. The beast growled, its hot breath against his skin. It was going for the kill. Then, without warning, Relka let out a thunderous roar. The sound was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard, a deep, bone-shaking vibration that echoed through the storm. The creatures froze. Their ears flattened against their skulls, their bodies stiff with fear. And then they ran. Ethan gasped for breath, clutching his bleeding shoulder. The pack of predators vanished into the snow, as if terrified by the sound of Relka's voice. He turned to her, stunned. What the hell was that? Relka shivered violently. She collapsed onto her hands and knees, gasping for air. "A warning," she muttered, her voice weak. "My people, we are not prey. But I am." She clenched her fists. Too weak. They knew it. Ethan sat up, wincing. Well, it worked. He exhaled, trying to ignore the burning pain in his shoulder. But we're not safe yet. Relka's breathing was ragged. She looked worse than before. The effort of that roar had drained what little energy she had left. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't a medic, and he had no idea how her biology worked. But if she didn't warm up soon, she was going to die. He looked at their fire. It was small, too small. "Damn it," he muttered. They needed more fuel, but he had already burned most of what he had scavenged. His eyes flicked to Relka. Her shivering was getting worse. Ethan sighed and unzipped his heated survival jacket. Without a word, he wrapped it around her shoulders. She stiffened. "What are you doing?" "You'll freeze to death." "I do not need." "Yes, you do." Ethan didn't let her finish. "Fire, heat, whatever keeps you alive, I don't care. Just take it." Relka hesitated, then pulled the jacket tighter around herself. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, and the storm raged on. Then, finally, Relka said, "Humans are strange." Ethan gave a tired chuckle. "Yeah, we get that a lot." She looked at him, her silver eyes unreadable. "You could have left me to die." Ethan shrugged. "Yeah, I could have." Silence. Then Relka whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Thank you." Ethan just stared at the fire, saying nothing. But somewhere in the distance, the predators were still out there, waiting. They had survived the first attack. But the night was long, and the fire wouldn't last forever. The fire of trust. The fire flickered weakly, struggling against the bitter wind. The storm had settled, but the temperature kept dropping, each gust of icy air gnawing at Ethan's skin. His shoulder ached where the predator had bitten him, but he ignored the pain. Right now, the real problem wasn't the wound. It was Relka. She sat beside the fire, wrapped in his heated survival jacket, but her condition wasn't improving. Her shivering was worse. Her normally shimmering blue skin had lost its glow, turning a dull pale hue. Every breath she took was ragged, labored, as if it took all her strength just to stay conscious. Ethan wasn't a doctor, and he sure as hell wasn't an alien biologist. But one thing was clear: she was dying. He moved closer, scanning her for any signs of improvement. "Hey," he said, nudging her shoulder. "You still with me?" Relka's silver eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "It is too cold." Ethan exhaled sharply. No kidding. He looked at the fire. It wasn't enough. He had already burned through most of his fuel, and without proper shelter, even sitting right next to the flames wouldn't be enough to keep Relka alive through the night. They needed more heat. Ethan glanced down at his survival suit. It had limited power designed to keep a human alive in extreme temperatures, but it wasn't built to warm both of them. Not for long. Still, it was the only option. He clenched his jaw and made a decision. Screw it. He reached behind his back, pulling at the suit's thermal regulator. With a few quick adjustments, he rerouted the heat output to maximum and leaned forward, pressing his body against Relka's. Her entire body stiffened. "What are you doing?" she rasped, her breath shaky. Ethan kept his voice calm. "Keeping you alive." Relka didn't respond, but he could feel the tension in her massive frame. Her people probably didn't have physical contact like this. Maybe it was a cultural thing. Maybe it was just because she thought humans were too weak to be worth touching. But right now, pride didn't matter. Ethan could already feel the heat transferring. His survival suit was struggling to keep up, but at least it was doing something. Minutes passed, then more. Slowly, Relka's shivering began to subside. Her breathing steadied, and the frost that had clung to her skin began to melt. Ethan let out a quiet breath of relief. It was working. For a long while, they sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant howling of the wind. Then softly, Relka spoke. "You are not afraid of me." Ethan blinked. "What?" She tilted her head slightly, her silver eyes watching him. "You are a human. My kind. We are warriors. You should fear me." Ethan snorted. "Lady, I just fought off a bunch of alien wolves and nearly froze to death. You'll have to try harder than that if you want to scare me." She studied him for a moment, then chuckled weakly, a deep, rumbling sound that didn't quite match her exhausted state. "You are strange," she murmured. Ethan smirked. "Yeah, I've been told." Relka was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke again, her voice quieter. "I was not supposed to be here." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, I got that part. What happened?" She hesitated. For the first time since they had met, she looked uncertain. Ethan waited. He wasn't going to push. She had already trusted him enough to let him help her. But if they were going to survive this, he needed to know the truth. Finally, she sighed. "My people abandoned me." Ethan frowned. "What? Why?" Relka looked away, staring into the fire. "I was meant to die here." Her words hung in the air like a curse. Ethan's fingers tightened around his plasma knife. "That doesn't make sense. You're a warrior, right? Why would they just leave you to freeze?" Relka exhaled slowly. "Because I failed." She clenched her fists, her sharp nails digging into her palms. "My people, our strength is everything. The weak do not survive. If you are not strong enough, you are left behind. Ethan narrowed his eyes. So what? One bad fight, and they just throw you away. Relka's gaze darkened. I lost a battle I was supposed to win. I failed my commander. That was enough. Ethan stared at her. The way she said it, it was like she had accepted it, like she had already decided she was supposed to die here. Well, screw that. Ethan leaned forward, his voice firm. You're not dead yet. She looked at him, surprised. He continued, I don't care what your people think. You're still breathing, and that means you get to decide what happens next. Relka didn't answer, but something in her eyes shifted just a little. Ethan sat back, glancing at the fire. Besides, if you were really weak, you wouldn't have scared off those predators with one roar. Relka gave a small, tired smile. That was not strength. That was desperation. Ethan shrugged. Desperation keeps people alive. Trust me, I know. The fire crackled, sending tiny sparks into the air. Relka's voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. You saved my life. Ethan sighed, rubbing his shoulder. Yeah, well, don't make me regret it. Relka chuckled again, this time a little stronger. I will try. They sat in silence for a while, the fire burning between them. But as Ethan stared into the flames, one thought nagged at the back of his mind. If her people abandoned her, that meant they knew she was here. And if they knew she was here, would they come back to finish the job? Ethan clenched his jaw. If they did, they were going to have a hell of a fight on their hands. The truth in the ice. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing weakly against the suffocating cold. The storm outside had calmed, but the silence that followed felt heavier, like the world itself was holding its breath. Ethan sat close to the flickering flames, rolling his aching shoulder where the predator had bitten him. The pain was manageable, but something else was gnawing at him. Relka. She had finally stopped shivering, her massive frame leaning slightly against the cave wall. His heated survival jacket was still wrapped around her, but her breathing was steadier now, her strength slowly returning. She should have looked better, stronger, but instead she looked lost. Ethan watched as she stared into the fire, her silver eyes distant, unfocused. She had said her people abandoned her, that she was meant to die here. And yet, she hadn't. Something didn't add up. Ethan shifted closer, poking at the fire with a piece of broken metal. Sparks jumped into the air before dying in the wind. All right, he said. Time to talk. Relka didn't move. Ethan exhaled sharply. You said your people left you here because you lost a battle. He met her gaze. What really happened? Relka's jaw tightened. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she reached into the folds of her armor and pulled something out. A small metallic device. Ethan tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his plasma knife. But she didn't activate it. She just held it in her palm, staring at it like it was the most dangerous thing in the world. I was not just left here to die, she said quietly. I was left here to be erased. Ethan frowned. Erased. She turned the device over in her hands. This is a beacon. It was meant to activate when I fell. When my body stopped functioning, it would send a signal so they could retrieve my remains. Ethan's stomach twisted. Wait. Your own people wanted to collect your corpse. Relka nodded. To prove I was dead. That I had failed. Ethan stared at the small, unassuming device. Then why is it off? Her fingers clenched around it. Because I turned it off myself. A heavy silence settled between them. Ethan was the first to speak. So, what, you were supposed to die out here, but you decided not to give them the satisfaction. Relka's gaze was sharp, piercing. No, I was supposed to die out here, but I learned something my people were never meant to know. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Which is? Relka exhaled slowly. She looked away, staring at the frozen cave walls as if they might hold the answer. My species, we are powerful, she said, stronger than humans, faster, more resilient. She flexed her massive fingers. We do not fear pain. We do not fear death. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Sure doesn't sound like it. She ignored him. But there is something we do fear, something my people would never admit. She turned back to him, her silver eyes glowing in the dim firelight. We fear the cold. Ethan blinked. The cold. Relka nodded. It is our greatest weakness. Our bodies shut down in freezing temperatures. We become slow, fragile, helpless. Ethan frowned. That doesn't make sense. If that's true, why the hell did they send you here? Relka's hands tightened around the beacon. Because they didn't know. Ethan's breath caught. Wait, you mean they didn't realize your species had a weakness to the cold? Relka shook her head. Not like this. We have always avoided frozen worlds. Our biology adapted to heat, to combat, to strength. But no one ever tested what would happen if we were exposed for too long. Until now. Ethan's stomach twisted. They used you as an experiment. Relka's silence was answer enough. Ethan let out a slow breath, trying to process. They sent you here, he said carefully, thinking you'd freeze to death. Then, when the beacon activated, they'd come pick up your body. And what? Study it. Learn exactly how your people react to the cold. Yes. Ethan clenched his fists. That's insane. Relka let out a bitter chuckle. No, it is efficient. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. So when you figured it out, you turned off the beacon. She nodded. If they do not retrieve my body, they will not know what I discovered. They will not know how we die in the cold. Ethan stared at her, realization dawning. You're trying to keep your weakness a secret. Relka's expression darkened. If my people learn the truth, they will change. They will adapt. And they will never fear the cold again. Ethan rubbed a hand down his face. So instead of giving them that knowledge, you're choosing to die alone. Relka looked down. It was meant to be my final act of defiance. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. For a species so obsessed with strength, Relka had made the strongest move of all, choosing to keep a weakness hidden, even at the cost of her own life. But that wasn't good enough. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. Well, that plan's out the window now. Relka frowned. What do you mean? Ethan grabbed his pack and slung it over his back. You're not dying here. And I'm sure as hell not letting you waste away just to keep your species' dirty little secret. Relka hesitated. I cannot leave. If they learn I survived, then we make sure they don't learn. Ethan smirked. No beacon, no proof, right? Relka stared at him, uncertain. You do not understand. My people do not leave things unfinished. If they suspect I live, they will come back. They will hunt me down. Ethan's smirk faded. Then we better make sure we're not here when they do. Relka hesitated. He could see the battle in her eyes. The instinct to fight, to resist, to do things her way. But finally, after a long pause, she nodded. Ethan let out a breath. Good. Because something tells me we don't have much time. As if to prove him right, a distant rumbling sound filled the air. Relka's head snapped toward the cave entrance. Ethan's pulse spiked. That's not thunder, is it? Relka's expression darkened. No, she said. It's a ship. A bond forged in fire. The rumbling sound grew louder, a low, menacing vibration that sent dust trickling from the cave walls. Ethan grabbed his plasma knife, heart pounding. He didn't need to see the ship to know what it meant. Relka's people were back. Relka stiffened beside him, her massive frame suddenly rigid. She wasn't shivering anymore. She wasn't weak anymore. She was alert. Prepared. Ethan's fingers tightened around his knife. How many of them are we dealing with? Relka exhaled sharply, her silver eyes scanning the cave entrance. If they have returned, it will not be just a retrieval team. They will come in force. Ethan cursed under his breath. Great. So, what 10, 20? Relka's jaw tightened. More. The rumbling deepened into a metallic hiss, the unmistakable sound of a ship's landing thrusters burning against the ice. Ethan turned to Relka. "You're sure they don't know you're alive?" Relka's fingers tightened around the deactivated beacon. "They will not take chances. If they are here, they will search for my body. And if they find nothing," her voice hardened, "they will assume I survived. And they will hunt me." Ethan blew out a slow breath, weighing their options. They couldn't just wait here. If Relka's people wanted her dead, they weren't going to leave empty-handed. And if they found both of them, Ethan had no doubt what would happen. He turned to Relka. "Can you fight?" Her eyes darkened. "Always." "Good." Ethan adjusted his survival suit. "Because we need to move. Now." The frozen escape. They left the cave in silence, moving carefully through the snow-covered landscape. The sky above was dark and heavy, the clouds thick with the remnants of the storm. Ethan's boots crunched softly against the ice as he followed Relka's lead. She moved differently now, not weak, not fragile. The way she carried herself was deliberate, predatory. The fire had changed her. Not just the fire Ethan had shared with her, but the fire that had refused to let her die. The ground trembled again as the ship touched down. Ethan and Relka dropped low behind an outcropping of jagged ice. A metallic hiss filled the air. Then came the sound of heavy boots striking the frozen ground. Ethan's breath caught. The search team had arrived. Relka stiffened beside him. He could feel the tension radiating from her, could almost hear the unspoken war raging in her mind. She had two choices, run or fight. Ethan already knew which one she'd pick. A deep voice echoed through the icy air. "Relka of the Emberborn, show yourself." The words were spoken in her language, a low growl that carried authority. Ethan glanced at her. She didn't move. Another voice spoke, this one colder. The beacon did not activate. "There is no body." A pause. Then a sharper command. "Find her." The fire within. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. They had seconds, maybe less. He turned to Relka. "Options." Her silver eyes were unreadable. "We fight." Ethan clenched his jaw. Of course. A pair of figures moved through the storm, tall, armored, carrying weapons that pulsed with blue energy. Ethan's grip tightened on his plasma knife. "Not good." Relka's voice was quiet. "You are human. If they see you, they will not hesitate." Ethan smirked. "Not much of a hesitation guy myself." Relka's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Then we make them hesitate." Ethan barely had time to process her words before she moved. Fast. The first soldier didn't even react before Relka was on him. She hit him like a collapsing mountain. Full force, no mercy. The impact sent the warrior flying into a frozen rock face, his armor cracking on impact. The second soldier spun, raising his weapon. Ethan lunged. His plasma knife met exposed flesh, a clean, brutal strike. The alien dropped, gasping. Silence. Relka turned to Ethan, breathing hard. The fire in her silver eyes burned like embers in a storm. She was awake now, alive. And for the first time, Ethan saw it. She had no intention of running. Ethan sighed. "You're not gonna leave, are you?" Relka shook her head. "No." Ethan rolled his eyes. Figured. A distant alarm blared through the storm. They had seconds before the rest of the team arrived. Ethan turned to Relka. "You got a plan?" She met his gaze and smiled. Yes. Ethan didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. But one thing was certain. The fire had awakened something in her. And there was no turning back now. The arrival. The sky split open with a metallic roar as the main warship descended through the storm, its thrusters sending waves of heat and snow into the air. Ethan and Relka crouched behind a jagged ice ridge, watching the landing zone below. The first search team had been wiped out, but that wouldn't stop the others. And now, The real force was arriving. Ethan felt his pulse hammering in his ears as the warship settled onto the frozen ground, its hull gleaming in the dim, cold light. It was massive. Not a scouting vessel, not a small retrieval team. This was a full execution force. The moment the landing ramp lowered, they marched out, a formation of towering armored warriors, their black and red battle suits cutting through the snow like living shadows. They moved with precision, controlled, deadly. Ethan counted at least 20 of them, maybe more. And at the front, leading them, stood someone different, a figure larger than the rest, his armor etched with deep scars from battles long past. He carried no visible weapon, because he didn't need one. Even from a distance, Ethan could feel his presence. Relka exhaled sharply. "Commander Voskar." Ethan didn't like the way she said it. "Friend of yours." She didn't answer right away, but the way her muscles tensed, Ethan knew the truth before she even spoke. "He was my mentor." Ethan turned back to the war party below. "So I'm guessing a warm welcome's off the table." Relka's expression hardened. "He trained me. He taught me that strength is everything." Her hands clenched into fists. "And now he is here to kill me." A voice like thunder. Voskar stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching against the ice. His deep, booming voice echoed across the frozen wasteland. "Relka of the Emberborn, you are out of time." Ethan felt the weight of those words sink into his chest. Relka's jaw tightened. "He knows." Ethan shot her a look. "Knows what?" She turned to him, eyes burning. "That I'm alive." Ethan swore under his breath. "Then why the hell is he calling your name? If he knows, why not just start shooting?" Relka shook her head. "He wants me to surrender first, to prove that I accept my fate." She turned back to the war party below, her silver eyes filled with something other than fear now. Ethan recognized it. Rage. Voskar raised his arms. "This world was meant to be your tomb." The soldiers around him stood still, waiting, watching. "Yet here you stand." Voskar continued, his voice deep and unwavering. "You disgrace our name. You tarnish the code." His gaze swept the battlefield. "And now, I see you have brought a human into this." Ethan stiffened as Voskar's gaze locked onto their hiding spot. He knew. The whole time, he'd known exactly where they were. The final offer. Voskar took a slow step forward. "You should not have survived," he said, his voice calmer now. "More dangerous. But you have." Relka didn't move. Voskar tilted his head. "And so, I give you a choice." The warriors behind him remained silent, their hands poised near their weapons, but not yet drawn. Ethan had seen executions before. This wasn't one. "Not yet. This is the law of our kind," Voskar said. "You can still die with honor." His voice dropped into a growl. "Surrender, Relka. Kneel before your people. Accept your failure. And I will grant you a swift death." Relka inhaled sharply, her massive frame shaking, not with fear, but with something else. Ethan whispered, "He's bluffing." Relka shook her head. "No, he means it." Ethan watched her closely. "You're not actually considering this, are you?" Relka exhaled slowly. "My whole life, I was told that only the strongest survive. That failure meant death." She looked at Ethan. "You saved me," she said. "And for the first time, I learned that strength is not just about surviving alone." Her silver eyes burned now. "My people are wrong." Ethan gave her a sharp grin. "Glad you're catching up." She turned back to Voskar, stepping forward so that the war party could see her clearly. She stood tall. She stood strong. And then she spoke, the rebellion of one. "I do not accept your offer." The words rippled through the warriors like a shockwave, a shift in the air, a silent challenge. Ethan could see it, the way some of them stiffened, uncertain. Because no one had ever done this before. Voskar's expression didn't change, but the storm in his eyes darkened. "You defy the code," he said. I defy you. Relka shot back. The tension snapped. Voskar moved like lightning, 1 second standing still, the next charging forward, his massive form cutting through the snow like a hurricane. Relka didn't flinch. Ethan barely had time to react before the first shot was fired. Battle in the snow. Everything exploded into motion. Ethan dived sideways, rolling behind a fallen ice pillar as energy blasts scorched the ground where he had just been standing. Relka met Voskar head-on. The impact sent a shockwave through the battlefield, the two warriors colliding like two planets in orbit. Voskar's fist struck first, a brutal, crushing blow that could have shattered steel. Relka caught it. Ethan barely had time to register the move before Relka twisted, using Voskar's own momentum to slam him into the ground. The warriors hesitated. They had expected an execution. Instead, they were watching something impossible. Relka was winning. Fire against ice. Ethan didn't waste time. He pulled his plasma pistol, fired 2 quick shots, taking out one warrior before the rest rushed him. A fist slammed into his ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. He staggered, barely blocking the second attack before he drove his blade upward, catching his attacker in the shoulder. The battlefield was chaos. But in the middle of it all, Relka was still standing. Still fighting, still refusing to kneel. And for the first time, Ethan saw it. The warriors around her weren't just fighting. They were watching. Because Relka wasn't just surviving. She was proving them wrong. And if she could do that, then maybe, just maybe, their whole way of life was about to change. The fire within. The battlefield was chaos. The frozen air was thick with the roar of battle, the clash of fists against armor, the crackle of energy weapons, and the heavy grunts of warriors locked in brutal combat. Ethan dodged a swipe from a plasma blade, dropping low and driving his knife into his attacker's leg. The warrior stumbled back with a snarl, and Ethan ripped his weapon free, rolling away before another could strike. But even as he fought, even as the adrenaline burned through him, he knew he was outmatched. These warriors weren't like humans. They were stronger, faster, bred for war. And if this fight dragged on, he wouldn't last. His eyes flicked to Relka, and what he saw made his breath catch. She wasn't just fighting. She was dominating. The breaking point. Voskar attacked relentlessly, his massive fists swinging like wrecking balls. The ground trembled beneath every blow. But Relka, she met him head-on. For every strike he threw, she dodged faster than before. For every crushing blow he landed, she absorbed it and struck back harder. Voskar snarled, his patience unraveling. "You grow desperate," he growled. "You cannot win." Relka's silver eyes burned. "I already have." She twisted, slamming her elbow into his ribs, a blow that cracked the unbreakable armor he wore. Voskar staggered. The warriors watching from the edges of the battle froze. They had expected an execution, not a fight. And now, their unshakable commander was falling back. A moment of hesitation, a crack in their belief. Relka saw it. Ethan saw it. And so did Voskar. The ember awakens. With a roar, Voskar surged forward, his hand closing around Relka's throat. Ethan's stomach clenched. But then, something changed. Relka's body lit with fire. Not flames, but something deeper, something primal. Her veins glowed like molten metal, and for the first time, she looked like she was born for this moment. Ethan had never seen anything like it, and neither had the others. Voskar's fingers trembled against her throat. His expression, once filled with cold certainty, shifted. Because for the first time in his life, he was afraid. Relka clenched her fists. "I am not weak." She ripped Voskar's hand away like it was nothing. The commander tried to react, but she was already moving. She hit him once, a single devastating strike to his chest. The force of it sent shockwaves rippling through his armor, through the very ground beneath them. And then, with a sound like cracking ice, Voskar fell. Silence before the storm. The battlefield froze. The warriors stared at their fallen leader, at Relka, at each other. And in that moment, Ethan saw something change in them. Doubt, fear, uncertainty. For generations, their laws had been absolute. Strength ruled. The weak perished. That was their way. And yet, here was Relka, a warrior abandoned to die, a warrior who had failed. Standing tall, standing stronger than any of them. Ethan swallowed, his heart hammering. This wasn't just a fight. This was a shift in history. The choice. Vosker gasped for breath, one hand clutching his shattered armor. His silver eyes, so much like Relka's, flickered with something Ethan never thought he'd see. Recognition. This is impossible, he rasped. Relka stepped closer, towering over him. No, it is the truth. The remaining warriors waited. They didn't attack, didn't move. They were waiting for a command, waiting for a new law to be spoken. Relka's voice was steady. I should be dead. The warriors flinched. But I am not, she continued. And neither are you. Her gaze swept across them, challenging them all. Strength is not just survival, she said. Strength is choosing to stand. Strength is choosing to fight when you should have fallen. She turned back to Vosker, lowering her voice. You taught me that only the strongest survive. She clenched her fists. Then stand up, or die on your knees. A new fire. The wind howled through the frozen wasteland. Vosker's breath came ragged. Then, slowly he moved. Not to attack, not to kneel, but to stand. For the first time in his life, he looked at Relka not as a failure, but as something else, something stronger. The other warriors shifted, watching their leader, waiting. And then, one by one, they lowered their weapons. Ethan let out a slow breath. Relka had done it. She had changed them. Not with fear, not with brute force, but with fire. The fire of defiance. The fire of survival. And as Ethan watched her, standing in the snow, standing in victory, he knew. This wasn't just about one warrior anymore. This was a revolution. Final words. Relka turned to Ethan, silver eyes burning. What now, human? Ethan smirked. Now. He glanced at the war party, at the storm fading in the distance. Now we see just how far that fire can spread.